On a chilly autumn evening in the heart of the city, Mr. Chen sat alone in his office at the Golden Palace restaurant, scrolling through online reviews on his computer. The warm glow of his desk lamp cast shadows on the walls covered with family photos and achievement certificates from his 20 years in the restaurant business. His eyes kept coming back to one particular review that had been bothering him all week. Food was amazing as always, but I noticed how differently they treated my uncle just because he wasn't dressed fancy, not cool at all. Mr. Chen leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his graying hair. This wasn't the first such comment he'd seen. Over the past few months, he'd noticed a troubling pattern in the reviews. While the food quality remained excellent, there were whispers about inconsistent service, how some guests were treated like royalty while others were barely acknowledged. He thought back to his own humble beginnings. 20 years ago, he'd started as a dishwasher in this very kitchen, saving every penny until he could buy the place from his old boss. Back then, he'd made a promise to himself. His restaurant would be a place where everyone felt welcome, regardless of their appearance or background. Looking at the old photographs on his wall, one caught his eye, a picture of him and his father at the restaurant's opening day. His father, despite working 3 jobs, had always been turned away from fancy restaurants because of his worn-out clothes. That memory still stung. Mr. Chen walked to his office window, watching as the evening crowd began filling the tables in his restaurant. From his vantage point, he could see everything: the bustling waiters, the smiling hostess, the satisfied customers. But something wasn't right. He needed to know the truth about how his staff really treated people when they thought he wasn't watching. That's when an idea struck him. At first, it seemed crazy, almost like something out of a movie. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He picked up his phone and called his old friend Raj, who worked in theater makeup at the local playhouse. "Hey Raj," he said, pacing his office. "Remember how you helped with my daughter's school play last year? I need a bigger favor this time." As he explained his plan, Mr. Chen felt both nervous and excited. He would become someone else entirely, someone his staff would never expect to see at Golden Palace. He would become the very type of customer he feared might be getting mistreated. The next morning, Mr. Chen met Raj at his workshop behind the theater. For 2 hours, they worked on perfecting his disguise. Raj applied professional aging makeup, carefully crafting wrinkles and age spots. They found the perfect gray wig and even added subtle details like slightly yellowed teeth and weathered hands. The transformation continued with clothes from the theater's costume department. Nothing too dramatic, just worn-out jeans, a faded jacket with a few carefully placed tears, and scuffed shoes. They even created a slight tremor in his right hand and practiced a humble, slightly hesitant way of speaking. Looking in the mirror, Mr. Chen barely recognized himself. The person staring back at him looked at least 20 years older, worn down by life's hardships. His own mother wouldn't have known it was him. "This is perfect," he said to Raj, his voice shaking a bit. "Absolutely perfect." As the sun began to set, Mr. Chen felt butterflies in his stomach. He would visit his own restaurant that evening during the busiest dinner rush. He chose this time deliberately. When the staff would be under the most pressure, their true colors would show more easily. Before leaving, he sat in his car for a few minutes, getting into character. He thought about his father, about all the people who'd ever been judged by their appearance, about the responsibility he had to make things right. This wasn't just about catching bad behavior, it was about making sure his restaurant lived up to the values he always believed in. With a deep breath, he stepped out of his car, parked 3 blocks away from Golden Palace. He practiced his shuffling walk as he made his way toward the restaurant, keeping his head slightly down, his shoulders hunched. A few passers-by barely gave him a glance, some even crossed the street to avoid him, exactly the kind of treatment he was worried about. As he approached the familiar golden doors of his restaurant, Mr. Chen felt his heart pounding. Through the windows, he could see the warm lighting, the happy families, the efficient staff moving between tables. In just a few minutes, he would find out what kind of place Golden Palace really was when the owner wasn't around. He reached for the door handle with trembling fingers, not entirely having to act anymore. The moment of truth had arrived. As he stepped inside, the familiar smell of ginger and garlic hit him, along with the soft music he'd personally chosen for the dining room. but for the first time in 20 years, he felt like a stranger in his own restaurant. Little did his staff know that this seemingly insignificant moment would change everything at Golden Palace forever. As Mr. Chen stepped into his restaurant, the familiar chime of the doorbell felt different somehow. Usually, it welcomed him as the owner, but tonight, it seemed to announce him as an unwanted guest. The hostess station was empty for a moment, and he could feel the curious glances from nearby diners. The sweet aroma of honey walnut shrimp drifted from the kitchen, making his stomach growl. He hadn't eaten all day, too nervous about his plan. Now, standing here in his disguise, he realized this hunger would make his role even more convincing. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the hostess returned to the station. It was Lisa, a college student who'd been working at Golden Palace for about 6 months. Mr. Chen had hired her himself, impressed by her warm smile and friendly demeanor during the interview. Now, he would see if that warmth extended to everyone. He shuffled forward, keeping his shoulders hunched and his hand trembling slightly, just as he'd practiced with Raj. Excuse me," he said softly, his voice disguised with a slight quaver. "Would it be possible to get a table?" Lisa looked up from her tablet, and Mr. Chen held his breath. This was the moment of truth. Would she see a human being or just a shabby coat and unwashed hair? To his relief, her smile appeared genuine. "Of course, sir. Would you prefer a quiet corner? We have a lovely spot by the window." She grabbed a menu and gestured for him to follow. As they walked through the dining room, Mr. Chen noticed how other customers reacted. Some quickly looked away, while others pulled their bags closer, reactions that made his heart heavy. He'd never noticed these small moments of prejudice before, perhaps because no one had ever treated him that way. Lisa led him to a corner table, slightly hidden behind a decorative screen. Was this thoughtful privacy or an attempt to hide him from other customers? He wasn't sure yet. "Your server will be right with you," she said, placing the menu gently on the table. "Would you like some water to start?" He nodded gratefully, and she hurried off. Looking around, he could see the entire dining room from this vantage point. Another detail he never noticed before. The tables were filled with families celebrating birthdays, couples on dates, business people closing deals. The light from the paper lanterns cast a warm glow over everything, just as he'd always intended when he designed the space. A few minutes passed, and no server appeared. He watched as other newly seated customers were greeted promptly, offered drinks, told about specials. His water glass remained empty, his table neglected. Just as he was beginning to feel his heart sink, he heard quick footsteps approaching. "I'm so sorry for the wait, sir." It was Jenny, one of his newest servers. She placed a glass of water with lemon on his table, along with a small bowl of crispy noodles, the complimentary appetizer that every table was supposed to receive. "We're a bit short-staffed tonight, but that's no excuse for keeping you waiting. Have you dined with us before?" Mr. Chen shook his head, keeping his eyes down as he'd practiced. "No, I've walked by many times," but he let his voice trail off, implying what many might assume, that he couldn't usually afford it. Jenny's smile didn't waver. "Well then, you're in for a treat. Our chef makes everything fresh daily." She proceeded to point out some of the more affordable options on the menu, but without being condescending. "The house special fried rice is my personal favorite. It comes with vegetables and your choice of protein." As she spoke, Mr. Chen noticed movement at the server station. 2 other servers were watching, whispering to each other. One of them, Tom, was shaking his head disapprovingly. Jenny either didn't notice or chose to ignore them. "Take your time with the menu," she said warmly. "I'll check back in a few minutes. Would you like some hot tea while you decide?" After Jenny left, Mr. Chen observed how differently she was treated by her colleagues. Tom and another server, Cindy, seemed to be giving her the cold shoulder. He could hear snippets of their whispered conversation, waste of time, and probably can't even tip. His heart felt heavy. These were people he trusted with his business, people who smiled at him every day. How had he missed these attitudes? How long had this been going on? Jenny returned with his tea, pouring it with the same care she would show to any guest. "Have you decided, sir, or do you need a few more minutes?" Mr. Chen ordered the house special fried rice, his own recipe, though of course Jenny didn't know that. As she wrote down his order, Tom approached their corner. "Jenny," he said sharply, Table 12 needs you. I'll take over here." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Jenny hesitated, looking between Tom and Mr. Chen. Something in her expression showed she knew exactly what was happening. "It's okay," she said firmly. "I've got this table covered. Could you check on 12 for me instead?" Tom's face darkened, but Jenny stood her ground. Mr. Chen felt a surge of pride. This was exactly the kind of integrity he'd always hoped to foster in his restaurant. As Tom stalked away, Jenny turned back to Mr. Chen with an apologetic smile. "Your order will be right up, sir. Please let me know if you need anything else." Sitting there, sipping the tea he'd selected for his restaurant years ago, Mr. Chen realized this experiment was revealing far more than he'd expected. It wasn't just about how his staff treated customers, it was about how they treated each other, how they handled pressure, how they responded to prejudice. The real test was just beginning. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam into the dining room. Mr. Chen watched as plates of food made their way to different tables, each one carefully presented just as he'd trained his staff to do. His own stomach growled again as he waited for his fried rice, reminding him that he hadn't eaten all day. Through the corner of his eye, he noticed Tom heading toward the manager's office. A few minutes later, he emerged with Mr. Lee, the evening manager. Mr. Chen felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't considered that Mr. Lee might get involved. Would his disguise hold up under his manager's scrutiny? Mr. Lee walked slowly through the dining room, pretending to check on various tables while clearly making his way toward the corner where Mr. Chen sat. Jenny appeared just then, carrying a steaming plate of house-special fried rice. "Here you are, sir," she said warmly, placing the plate in front of him. The presentation was perfect, exactly as he'd specified in training. She'd even added the optional garnish of fresh cilantro that many servers often forgot. "Would you like some chili oil or extra soy sauce?" Before Mr. Chen could respond, Mr. Lee appeared at the table. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone professional but cool. His eyes darted between Jenny and Mr. Chen, then did a quick scan of the nearby tables, probably checking if other customers were uncomfortable. "Yes, thank you," Mr. Chen replied softly, keeping his eyes down as he picked up his chopsticks. "The young lady has been very kind." Mr. Lee nodded stiffly. "Jenny, could I speak with you for a moment?" It wasn't really a question. Jenny hesitated, then followed Mr. Lee to the service station, leaving Mr. Chen to observe while pretending to focus on his food. He couldn't hear their entire conversation, but Mr. Lee's body language told the story. The manager was standing rigid, arms crossed, while Jenny's shoulders were tense, but her chin was lifted defiantly. Bits of their conversation drifted over, image of the restaurant and certain standards from Mr. Lee, followed by Jenny's firm, "Every customer deserves respect." Mr. Chen felt a mix of emotions watching this scene unfold. Pride in Jenny's stance, disappointment in Mr. Lee, and a growing realization the problems in his restaurant ran deeper than he'd suspected. He'd promoted Mr. Lee 6 months ago, impressed by his efficiency and attention to detail. Now he wondered if he'd missed something crucial about the man's character. As he ate his fried rice, which was perfectly prepared, he noted with automatic professional pride. Mr. Chen observed more interactions around him. An elderly couple at a nearby table received prompt, cheerful service from their server. A family with young children was treated with patience as the kids made a mess with their noodles. But when a delivery driver came in to pick up an order, wearing his work uniform, Tom directed him to wait by the door rather than at the designated pickup counter. Jenny returned to his table, her cheeks slightly flushed but her smile genuine. "How is everything, sir? Is the rice seasoned to your liking?" "It's very good," he replied truthfully. "Thank you for your kindness." Her smile softened. "No thanks needed. Everyone deserves to enjoy a good meal in peace." She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in slightly. "Don't worry about Mr. Lee. This is my section, and I'll take care of you." Mr. Chen felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was exactly the spirit he tried to instill in his restaurant from the beginning, treating every guest like family. How had that vision become so distorted under his own roof? As the evening progressed, he noticed more details he might have missed as the owner. The busboy, young Peter, who usually rushed through his tasks, took extra care when clearing nearby tables, making sure no noise disturbed Mr. Chen's meal. The hostess, Lisa, kept an eye on his water glass from her station, signaling Jenny whenever it needed a refill. But he also saw the opposite. Tom and several other servers had created an invisible boundary around his corner, avoiding walking past unless absolutely necessary. When guests asked about the table behind the screen, they were told it was reserved, a small lie that made Mr. Chen's jaw clench. Mr. Lee passed by several more times, each time finding some small task to do nearby watching. His presence seemed to make some staff members uncomfortable, while others clearly took it as approval of their behavior. As Mr. Chen finished his meal, he noticed Jenny dealing with more than just disapproval from her colleagues. They were deliberately making her work harder, not helping with her other tables, forgetting to tell her when her orders were ready, taking longer to process her payments at the computer system. But she never let it show to her customers. She maintained her warm smile and attentive service to everyone in her section, from the business people in expensive suits to Mr. Chen in his shabby coat. When it came time to pay, Mr. Chen pulled out a worn wallet, carefully counting out crumpled bills that he deliberately aged for this purpose. He could see Tom watching from the server station, probably expecting him to leave without paying or to leave no tip. Jenny processed his payment with the same professional courtesy she'd shown throughout the meal. "Thank you for dining with us," she said warmly. "I hope you'll come back soon." As Mr. Chen stood to leave, he felt the weight of what he'd witnessed settling on his shoulders. His restaurant, his dream of creating a place where everyone felt welcome, had somehow become divided. Some of his staff still carried that vision, while others had created invisible barriers he never noticed from his position of privilege. He had seen enough. It was time for the next phase of his plan. The next evening, Mr. Chen returned to his restaurant in the same disguise, but this time he arrived earlier, just before the dinner rush began. The makeup felt more comfortable now, and he found himself slipping into the character more naturally. His hands remembered the slight tremor, his shoulders automatically hunched, and his steps became smaller and more uncertain. The restaurant was quieter at this hour. A few regular customers sat at their usual tables, business people finishing late lunches, and elderly couples who preferred eating before the evening crowd. The same hostess from the previous night wasn't there, but instead he was greeted by Amy, one of his longest-serving employees. "Oh," Annie said, her cheerful greeting falling flat when she saw him. We're actually quite full right now." She gestured at the nearly empty dining room, an excuse so transparent it made Mr. Chen's heart sink. "Please," he said softly, using the shaky voice he'd practiced. "I have money today. I've been saving up." He pulled out the carefully prepared wallet, making sure she could see the folded bills inside. Amy shifted uncomfortably, looking around as if hoping someone else would handle the situation. Just then, Jenny walked past with a water pitcher. She stopped, recognition flickering across her face. "Welcome back, sir," Jenny said warmly. "Would you like the same table as yesterday? I'm about to start my shift." Amy looked between them, surprise evident on her face. Before she could respond, Mr. Lee emerged from the office, his expression darkening when he saw Mr. Chen. "Jenny," Mr. Lee said sharply, "aren't you supposed to be setting up your section?" "I am," Jenny replied calmly. "And this gentleman will be dining in my section again today." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other staff members had stopped their prep work to watch the scene unfold. Mr. Chen could see Tom whispering to another server, both of them shaking their heads. To his surprise, Peter, the young busboy, stepped forward. "I just finished cleaning that corner table, Jenny. It's all ready." His voice quivered slightly, but he stood his ground. Mr. Lee's face reddened, but he couldn't very well make a scene in front of the other customers. He turned on his heel and walked away, but not before Mr. Chen heard him mutter something about reviewing schedules, a thinly veiled threat that made his blood boil. Jenny led Mr. Chen to his table, but head held high despite the stares from her co-workers. "Our soup of the day is hot and sour," she said, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Would you like to try it?" As Mr. Chen settled in, he noticed something had changed from the previous night. The invisible boundary around his table had grown larger, with most staff members going well out of their way to avoid walking near him. But he also noticed something else, small acts of quiet rebellion from unexpected sources. Peter kept the water glasses filled without being asked. Lisa, who had just started her hostess shift, deliberately seated a young couple at the table next to his, breaking down the isolation barrier others had tried to create. And when Tom complained loudly about maintaining standards, an older waitress named Mrs. Wu quietly reminded him that she'd been a refugee herself once, and someone had given her a chance. The dinner rush began, and Mr. Chen watched the dynamics of his restaurant shift and change. Regular customers greeted Mr. Lee warmly, never noticing how differently he treated others. Jenny managed her section efficiently despite the continued cold shoulder from her colleagues. Even the kitchen staff seemed divided, some deliberately slowing down Jenny's orders, while others, including the head chef, made sure every plate that went to their tables was perfect. A young family was seated nearby, their children pointing excitedly at the fish tank that Mr. Chen had installed years ago. When one of the kids waved at him, the mother quickly pulled her child's hand down, whispering something that made the child's smile fade. Mr. Chen felt the sting of that moment deeply. He'd never imagined his restaurant would be a place where parents taught their children to fear or ignore others. As the evening wore on, he noticed Mr. Lee had stationed himself near the entrance, quietly warning the hosts about being more selective with seating arrangements. Several people who came in wearing work uniforms or less fancy clothes were told there would be at least an hour wait, despite plenty of empty tables. The final straw came when an elderly woman entered, her clothes clean but well worn. Mr. Chen recognized her as a retired teacher who used to eat here regularly years ago, though she came less often now. Before anyone could stop her, she walked straight up to his table. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, pulling out a chair. "I hate eating alone, and these young folks seem to have forgotten I used to grade their papers." She sat down without waiting for an answer, then called out to Jenny, "Dear, I'll have my usual, and don't let anyone give you trouble about it." Mr. Chen could see Mr. Lee's face turning purple from across the room. The other customers were staring. Tom and several other servers huddled together, whispering urgently. But Jenny just smiled, brought an extra place setting, and treated them both like valued guests. Watching all of this unfold, Mr. Chen made his decision. He'd seen enough. Tomorrow, everything would change. But first, he had one more role to play, that of a grateful customer sharing a meal with a kind stranger, both of them being served by people who remembered what hospitality really meant. Back in his office late that night, Mr. Chen carefully removed his disguise. His hands trembled slightly. This time not from acting but from genuine emotion. The retired teacher's kindness had touched him deeply, reminding him of why he'd started this restaurant in the first place. He looked at his reflection in the small office mirror as he wiped away the last traces of makeup. The face staring back at him seemed older somehow, weathered not by the theatrical aging, but by the weight of what he'd discovered over the past 2 days. A knock on his office door made him jump. "Come in," he called, quickly checking that no traces of his disguise remained visible. The door opened to reveal his head chef, Mr. Wang, holding a cup of tea. "You're here late," the chef said, placing the cup on Mr. Chen's desk. Then he paused, looking more closely at his boss's face. "Is everything okay? You look different." Mr. Chen picked up the tea, buying time to steady his voice. "Tell me," he said carefully, "have you noticed any changes in how we treat our customers lately?" Mr. Wang pulled up a chair, his usually energetic demeanor turning serious. "You mean besides Mr. Lee turning away people he doesn't think look right for the restaurant? Or how some servers avoid certain tables like they're afraid of catching poverty?" There was an edge of anger in his voice that surprised Mr. Chen. "You've noticed?" "Of course I've noticed. I see everything from my kitchen window." Mr. Wang leaned forward. "You know what else I've noticed? Every time I try to send out extra dumplings to someone who looks hungry, Tom or one of the others intercepts the plate. They say they're maintaining standards, but..." He shook his head in disgust. Mr. Chen felt a mix of shame and relief. Shame that he hadn't seen these problems sooner, relief that he wasn't the only one who cared. "What would you do," he asked, "if you were in my position?" Mr. Wang didn't hesitate. "I'd remind everyone why this place exists. It's not about fancy plates or rich customers. It's about food bringing people together." He smiled slightly. "Like that old man who's been coming in the past couple nights. Did you see how that retired teacher sat with him today? That's what a restaurant should be." Mr. Chen nearly choked on his tea. You recognized him." You mean, did I recognize you? Mr. Wang chuckled at Mr. Chen's shocked expression. I've been cooking your food for 15 years. You think I wouldn't notice how you hold your chopsticks, even in disguise? Or how you always check the rice first, just like you do during quality inspections? For a moment, Mr. Chen could only stare at his old friend. Then both men burst out laughing, the tension of the past few days breaking like a storm cloud. Why didn't you say anything? Mr. Chen finally asked. Because you needed to see it for yourself. And others needed to show their true colors. Mr. Wang's expression turned serious again. So, what are you going to do about it? Mr. Chen stood up and walked to the window overlooking the now empty dining room. The tables gleamed in the dim light, waiting for tomorrow's customers. Each one represented a chance to get things right or wrong. First, he said slowly, I need to finish what I started. One more night in disguise. I want to see how they act when they think they've won, when they think they can turn people away without consequences. Mr. Wang nodded approvingly. And then we remind everyone what hospitality really means. Mr. Chen turned back to his friend. But I'll need your help. All the kitchen staff will need to be ready. Tomorrow night, things are going to change. They spent the next hour planning, Mr. Wang offering insights about which staff members could be trusted, which ones needed guidance, and which ones might resist change. He told Mr. Chen about Jenny's struggles with her co-workers, about Peter's small acts of kindness, about Mrs. Wu's quiet influence on the younger staff. As they talked, Mr. Chen made notes in a small notebook, documenting everything he'd seen and heard. The list of necessary changes grew longer, but so did the list of staff members who might help make those changes possible. One more thing, Mr. Wang said as he stood to leave. That soup you ordered yesterday? I made it extra spicy, just the way you like it. Dead giveaway. He winked and headed back to finish cleaning his kitchen. Alone again, Mr. Chen looked at his reflection once more. Tomorrow, he would put on his disguise for the last time. Tomorrow, he would see if anyone else would stand up for what was right. Tomorrow, he would reclaim his restaurant's soul. He pulled out the disguise he'd been using, the old coat, the gray wig, the makeup kit his friend had given him. One more night of pretending to be someone else, so his restaurant could become itself again. As he prepared to leave, he noticed a new review posted online. Food was great as always, but something's wrong with this place lately. It's like they've forgotten what matters most. No, Mr. Chen whispered to himself, we haven't forgotten. We just needed a reminder. He turned off his office light and headed home, already rehearsing in his mind how tomorrow's revelation would unfold. The Golden Palace had lost its way, but he was finally ready to set things right, not just for the customers who'd been turned away, but for everyone who believed that a restaurant could be more than just a place to eat. It could be a place where dignity was served alongside every meal. The next evening, the Golden Palace was bustling with its usual dinner crowd when Mr. Chen walked in for the third time in his disguise. This time, though, something felt different. He carried himself with a slight edge of confidence, knowing this would be the last time he'd wear these tattered clothes. The dinner rush was in full swing. Jenny wasn't at her usual station, and Mr. Chen overheard another server saying she'd been assigned to work in the back storage room, taking inventory, clearly a punishment from Mr. Li for her kindness the previous nights. Mr. Li himself was standing at the host station, speaking quietly but firmly to Emmy. Just remember what we talked about, he was saying. We have standards to maintain. As Mr. Chen approached, Mr. Li turned to face him directly. Gone was any pretense of professional courtesy. I'm sorry, he said, not sounding sorry at all, but we're fully booked tonight. Mr. Chen looked past him at the nearly empty section where he'd sat the previous nights. Several tables were clearly available, their reserved signs hastily placed. Before he could speak, he heard a familiar voice. Fully booked. Mrs. Wu stepped forward from her section. That's strange, because I know for a fact tables 7, 9, and 12 are open. I just finished cleaning them myself. Her voice carried across the entrance area, causing several customers to look up from their meals. Mr. Li's face darkened. Mrs. Wu, this isn't your concern. Please return to your section. Actually, Mr. Chen said, straightening his shoulders slightly, it is her concern. It's everyone's concern. He reached up and slowly peeled off the fake beard that had been part of his disguise for the past 3 days. The restaurant fell silent as he removed the wig next, then used a handkerchief to wipe away some of the makeup. Mr. Lee's face went from red to white in an instant, and he dropped her menus. From the kitchen doorway, the chef's mouth fell open mid-sentence. Mr. Chen? Mr. Lee stuttered, taking a step backward. We didn't. Save it, Mr. Chen said quietly, but his voice carried in the silent restaurant. I've seen enough over the past 3 days. I've seen exactly how this restaurant treats people when you think I'm not watching. By now, other staff members had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Someone had called Jenny from the storage room, and she stood in the doorway, eyes wide with surprise. 3 days ago, Mr. Chen continued, his voice growing stronger, I sat in my office reading reviews about inconsistent service, about people being treated differently based on how they looked or what they wore. I couldn't believe it was happening in my restaurant, so I decided to see for myself. He turned to face his assembled staff. Some of you showed me exactly who you are. You showed me how you treat people you think don't matter. His eyes rested on Tom, who seemed to be trying to blend into the wallpaper. You showed me how quickly you forget that every person who walks through that door is a human being deserving of respect. Mr. Chen's voice softened as he turned to others. But some of you made me proud. Jenny, who treated everyone with equal kindness and stood up to pressure and bullying to do what was right. Peter, who found small ways to help despite his junior position. Mrs. Wu, who remembered her own past and spoke up for others. He walked to the center of the dining room, addressing not just his staff, but all the customers who were watching in stunned silence. When I opened Golden Palace 20 years ago, I made a promise. This would be a place where everyone was welcome, where the food would be good, yes, but more importantly, where every person who walked through that door would be treated with dignity and respect. Mr. Chen's voice cracked slightly as he continued. My own father was turned away from restaurants because of how he looked. He worked 3 jobs to put me through school, but his clothes were worn, his hands were rough, and fancy places didn't want him there. I promised myself my restaurant would be different. He turned back to Mr. Lee. I trusted you to uphold those values. Instead, you created an environment where kindness was punished and prejudice was rewarded. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Even the kitchen had gone quiet. Mr. Chen reached into his shabby coat and pulled out a small notebook. For 3 days, I wrote down everything I saw, every act of kindness, every act of discrimination, every whispered comment, every rolled eye, every excuse used to turn people away. And now, he straightened his shoulders, once again every inch the restaurant owner. Now things are going to change. Little did anyone realize that this moment would completely transform not just the Golden Palace, but the lives of everyone who worked there. The morning after Mr. Chen's revelation, the Golden Palace was closed for the first time in 5 years. A staff meeting in progress, sign hung on the front door, while inside, every employee sat in the dining room, the morning sun streaming through the windows they usually cleaned before opening. Mr. Chen stood at the front, looking different not just because he'd removed his disguise, but because of the quiet authority he carried. The previous night's events had left everyone shaken, and the room was silent except for the gentle hum of the fish tank. First, Mr. Chen said, his voice gentle but firm, I want to thank those who showed compassion during my test. Jenny, please stand up. Jenny rose slowly, her face flushed. Sir, I was just doing my job. No, Mr. Chen interrupted. You were doing more than your job. You were being human. He smiled warmly. Starting today, you're our new evening manager. The room erupted in scattered applause, led enthusiastically by Peter and Mrs. Wu. Mr. Lee, sitting in the corner, stared at his hands. Peter, Mr. Chen continued, your small acts of kindness didn't go unnoticed. The way you made sure everyone had water, how you cleaned tables with equal care regardless of who sat there. You're young, but you understand something many others have forgotten. Peter sat straighter in his chair, his usual nervous fidgeting forgotten for a moment. Mrs. Wu, Mr. Chen turned to the older waitress. Your words about being a refugee, about someone giving you a chance. They reminded me of my own father. Would you be willing to help train our new staff members? To teach them what true hospitality means? Mrs. Wu wiped a tear from her eye and nodded, unable to speak. Then Mr. Chen's expression grew more serious. Now for the difficult part. He opened his notebook. Over 3 days, I witnessed behavior that has no place in this restaurant. Tom, you deliberately sabotaged a fellow server because you didn't approve of her customers. Emmy, you lied to people about table availability based on their appearance. And Mr. Lee, the former manager looked up, his face pale. You didn't just participate in discrimination, you encouraged it. You punished kindness and rewarded prejudice. That ends today. You're all suspended for 2 weeks. When you return, you'll work under Jenny's supervision, and Mrs. Wu will retrain you in our values. If you're not willing to change, there's no place for you here. The silence in the room was heavy. Then Tom stood up, his chair scraping loudly. This is ridiculous. You can't expect us to serve just anybody. We have a reputation to maintain. A reputation for what? Mr. Chen asked quietly. For turning away people like my father. For teaching children it's okay to judge people by their clothes. He shook his head. No. Our reputation should be for good food and kindness. Nothing else matters. He walked to the center of the room. Starting today, things will be different. We're instituting new policies. He held up a stack of papers. First, no more selective seating. Every customer gets the first available table period. Second, we're starting a weekly community dinner where people can pay what they can afford. The room buzzed with whispers. Mr. Chen continued. Third, we're partnering with the local shelter to provide job training. Peter will help coordinate this program, with a raise to reflect his new responsibilities. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. Some of you might think this will hurt our business, but let me tell you a story. 20 years ago, when I was still a dishwasher, an old man came in during a snowstorm. His clothes were wet, and he looked cold. The owner at the time, Mr. Chen, smiled at the memory. She not only fed him but gave him a job. That man was my father, and her kindness changed our lives. The morning light had grown stronger, casting a warm glow across the dining room. That's the legacy I want for Golden Palace. Not just a place where people come to eat, but a place where everyone feels welcome. Over the next few months, the changes transformed the restaurant. Some staff members left, unable or unwilling to adapt. But those who stayed found themselves part of something special. The community dinners became popular events, bringing together people from all walks of life. Regular customers started contributing to a fund that helped subsidize meals for those who couldn't afford them. Jenny proved to be an excellent manager, her natural kindness balanced with quiet strength. Under her guidance, new staff members learned to treat every guest like family. Peter's job training program helped several people find stable employment, not just at Golden Palace, but at other restaurants in town. 6 months after his undercover experiment, Mr. Chen sat at a table during the busy dinner rush, watching his dream finally become reality. A business executive sat next to a construction worker at the counter. A teacher shared a table with a homeless man she'd met at last week's community dinner. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Jenny approached his table with a pot of tea, the same blend he'd been served when he sat here in disguise. Busy night, she said with a smile. Good busy, he replied, watching as Mrs. Wu taught a new server the proper way to greet guests, the right kind of busy. Through the front window, he could see the restaurant sign glowing in the evening darkness. But now it meant something more than just a place to eat. It had become what he'd always wanted, a place where food brought people together, where kindness was served daily, and where everyone, no matter who they were or what they wore, could find a warm welcome and a good meal. The Golden Palace had become not just a restaurant, but a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change everything.